Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
We're here today, obviously, to present an award to one of the great Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger. Even more importantly, I think, to listen to Henry. Henry has been, in my view, one of the great strategists and one of the great analysts of American policy and its problems and its challenges. And I never found a time when I had an opportunity to listen to Henry Kissinger I didn't learn a lot new, and found out that in many ways, he had the kind of unique perspective that we all look forward to hearing from. It's fascinating that when people in particular think they have special problems with Asia, they always think of Henry as perhaps the best and most important willing voice and willing ear to consult on those kinds of issues. And he has a unique relationship with the Chinese leadership over the years. As they have developed, they've always, in fact, held a personal place of special esteem for Dr. Kissinger in the seminal work that he and President Nixon did in changing the U.S. relationship to China. We're interested in the fact that the word pivot and rebalancing, often used to describe the Obama approach to Asia and some of the recent changes, perhaps conveys unnecessarily a note of winners and losers. And I think that we wanted to see through Dr. Kissinger how he saw this strategically and whether, in fact, he could help us through the great Washington audience that's been assembled for this particular program. And indeed, in the tradition of Joe Sisco, put it this way, put the pieces together in a way that makes great sense and conveys a understanding that grows out of Dr. Kissinger's enormous and important role in China policy over the years and the attention that he has traditionally paid to Asia from, put it this way, from Russia to Indonesia. The American Academy of Diplomacy is principally concerned with how and in what way it can promote the use of diplomacy and the understanding of diplomacy. And the World Affairs Council reaches out to America in a very broad and I think very successful way on a regular basis to convey ideas, thoughts, and attitudes, and in many cases touch on diplomacy, the challenges of diplomacy, and how they can move ahead. And the Council has been absolutely terrific in having a countrywide organization of chapters with loyal members, but many who also follow the work of the Council, take advantage of the offerings of the Council, if I can put it that way, to educate themselves on foreign policy issues, on national security issues, and on diplomacy and how it plays a role in dealing with those questions.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming today. I think we have a real treat lined up, and the comments we're going to be hearing in a few minutes here. We have two very notable gentlemen with very long and distinguished careers in the history of our national diplomacy that we'll be hearing from today. And their lives are also have been characterized by scholarship, public service, hands-on experience, recognized success, and dealing with grappling with some very tough problems as they've emerged from our nation. All in the service of our American ideals of liberty, the rule of law, and the advancement of hopefully the human condition around the world. So just stop and think about it a second. Some of these terms: the Nobel Peace Prize, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, U.S. Army veteran, leader in the Paris Peace Accords, realpolitik, detente, the roots of our relationships with the People's Republic of China. These are very, these are terminology that are notable to us all and part of a very distinguished career of the gentleman we're going to introduce. And It just notifies and it just exemplifies what we look in public service and the people who serve our nation rolled into one man. And besides all of this public service, he's a pretty good soccer player too. So we need to note that. As a young man, Henry Kissinger saw firsthand the depths of how a civilized nation can lose its values, can sink, and turn when it ignores those values. His first role as a public service was in the United States Army 70 years ago. His German fluency and obvious intellect found him assigned to administer the just captured city of Krefeld. It's worth noting that Dr. Kissinger performed all of these duties as a private. So even then, he was punching well above his weight. So, Dr. Kissinger spent the 1950s as both a student and a faculty member up at Harvard. He then became an author and a fellow at several influential think tanks. By the time he became the director of President Nixon's National Security Council in 1969, there could have scarcely been a better qualified person for that role. His prodigious talents were used to negotiate an end to America's involvement in the Vietnam War and to arrange for President Nixon's historic trip to China. His Nobel Prize was awarded in 1973 and was very hard-earned and richly deserved in that era of our history. Dr. Kissinger, as you know, then served as Secretary of State under both President Nixon's and Ford. Today, Dr. Kissinger is the chairman of Kissinger Associates, an international consulting firm, and he also continues to be a very active author, as we saw, autographing copies of the book here at the table, analyst, and of course today we get the privilege of him being a speaker. In addition, a few men have had more experience in the working nuts and bolts of our nation's diplomacy than our other guest, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. After graduating from Bowdoin and obtaining master's degrees both from Tufts and the University of Melbourne, he went on to serve in the United States Navy and Reserves. He then embarked on a 40-year career of public service, and he does hold the nation's highest honor as an ambassador, that of career ambassador. To earn this, Ambassador Pickering led our embassies in some very diverse nations around the world: Jordan, Nigeria, El Salvador, Israel, India, and Russia. And again, at times when our relationship to those nations were evolving and in some cases becoming very testy. Ambassador Pickering also has served as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and as he retired from public service, he was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. As you look at the comments that have been made about Ambassador Pickering during his career, you can constantly see best qualified person to represent the United States in several of his assignments around the world. Ambassador Pickering is also very active in the private sector. He participates in many think tanks, and he also serves as an advisor. So these are giants indeed. I had the privilege of growing up locally here in Fairfax County, seeing a lot of these events up close, and since Senator Warner's here, I had to get in the kid from Virginia comment, sir, so thank you. So Dr. Kissinger and Ambassador Pickering today will talk to us about timely events associated in Asia, very timely events. They continue to go on this week, and what they think some of our strategic focus ought to be in that region. So I can't wait to hear what you say, and I'm going to get off the stage and let's start.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, very much for those wonderful words. I would, in a Kissingerian fashion, remind you that from time to time, ambassadors are paid to make relations testy. Today, we are going to have the dialogue with Dr. Kissinger in two parts. I'll participate in the first part with some questions that I have for Dr. Kissinger, and then you, and don't forget your blue cards. As I reminded Dr. Kissinger, we're using the communist system. you write your questions out, and then we approve them, and then we give them to Dr. Kissinger. But we'll try to find your best and most, put it this way, interesting, introspective, and perhaps insistent questions for Dr. Kissinger in the second half of the hour. I'd like to begin, Henry, if I may, with the title of why we're here. I think there's good reason to believe that Asia remains and will be terrifically important. We're now pivoting to Asia, or we're rebalancing to Asia, or maybe we're doing something that's kinder and gentle to other parts of the world. I'm not sure. But would you give us your sense of how you see Asia fitting into American policy in the next decade? What are our strategic interests that we need to pay attention to? And what thoughts and advice would you have for the president and the incoming presidents on how they should be looking at Asia over the 10 years to come?
Any of you who have any illusions that you get to ask questions, abandon them now after such a... It's in the nature of foreign policy that conditions change around the world. And in the immediate post-war period, post-World War II period, the focal point of foreign policy was Europe. The restoration of Europe, protection of Europe. And since then, Europe remains important, but it is now safe from a military attack. But in Asia, we have seen the emergence of a number of major countries of a scope much greater than the European national states. And we have, of course, India and Japan recovering, and China. And so a rebalancing of American policy was inevitable. I thought that the pivot, that there were two aspects to remember about the pivot. People say it was too military because now a larger percentage of our military force is in Asia than before. But the fact is that this came about largely because we reduced our forces somewhere else, not because we augmented the forces in Asia all that much. And secondly, I don't think the issue of Asia, of the international order of Asia, is exclusively or primarily a military problem. In fact, in my view, the challenge is this. I'm a great friend of China, but I have always said that we do not, it's not in the American interest or the world interest to have one country exercise hegemony over all of Asia. But in contrast to Europe, to the European issue, this is not a military problem primarily. It's a problem of political, social relationships of China and the United States with the countries that are surrounding China. So, of course, we should have adequate military forces accessible to Asia. But I would not design them in such a way that they look as designed for offensive operations. And China, that everybody, therefore, should exercise restraint to permit the economic and political elements to play a role. Now, when I was a professor at Harvard, and for many years afterwards, I've written a lot about the balance of power, and I've thought a lot about the balance of power. But we have to understand we're in a new period now, and that the classic concept, the relation between China and the United States, is crucial for determining what kind of world order emerges. If China and we emerge in a position of constant confrontation, then it will slide into some crisis, much as Europe did before World War I. It'd be a disaster for everybody. So that is my basic reaction, put in its brief terms, as my Germanic origin permits.
Henry, let me move to the subject that you raised at the end of your discussion of Asia, China. You have perhaps the best relations with successive Chinese leaders of any American. You've had many opportunities to talk at length with them. I think it's safe for me to include Tu Xi. Where do you see China going in the light of what it is they have to say about their own vision for themselves for the future? Are we inevitably engaged in a situation where we will get to that position that you're warning us about finding a way to avoid? Colossal continuing tension and worse. And what approach, aside from being careful and low key, should we be taking to the Chinese as a way to help condition what the decade ahead and beyond will look like, to, in effect, have the U.S.-Chinese relationship be something that verges on the constructive rather than the destructive?
That's the key issue. And there are some cultural obstacles to it. In this sense, Americans think that every problem has a solution. And they think that it is our task in the world to educate those who have not yet caught on. So the temptation of our foreign policy is to offer a program with a time limit after which the problem is supposed to have gone away. The Chinese culturally think that there is no final solution to any problem, that every so-called solution is an admissions ticket to another set of problems. So the American approach is to deal with the symptoms. The Chinese general approach, and this has been true of, I would say, without exception of any leader that I met, it's conceptual. They are asking, where are we trying to go? Maybe excessively so that they ascribe complicated motives to American very pragmatic action. So that's one problem. Secondly, it's a different history. We are brought up on a world of sovereign states and equality of states and so forth. That's never been the Chinese experience. Through the longest period of Chinese history, they were the dominant country, and they thought of the world as their being the central kingdom and all other countries being in some kind of tributary relationship to them. China didn't have a foreign ministry until the end of the 19th century. And so these are different approaches that are inherent in the situation. and it is, of course, true that when countries have the magnitude of our economies, of the two economies, that they will impinge on each other around the world. So the traditional view would be to win as many of those arguments as one can and line up as many people as one can. But as we said before, I think that is the road to permanent crisis. And so what I think is needed is a sense of partnership among potential adversaries. And that's never been done before. So it's very hard to do. Interestingly enough, the leaders of both sides are actually saying this. So as a concept, this is not disputed, but they have found it harder to develop policies where they share on a regular basis perceptions and projects so that a tradition develops of some kind of automatic cooperation. And it's difficult because there are many countries in Asia who look at the United States as their security shield. And it is important for us to respond to this, but we have to find, and it's a big challenge, we have to find a way by which we and China cooperate on the essential points and compete in these other areas as political and social rivals, but not as military rivals. And, if somebody had said that to me when I was teaching, I would have said, that's ridiculous. That can't happen. But we now live in a world in which there are problems like environment, cyber proliferation, that are global problems that you can't segment into national problems. So this is the concept that I believe in.
Japan, India, Korea, Iran, Pakistan are all presenting us with a congery of problems and a set of issues. Some related to China, some only very distantly. How do you see these countries playing into the region and beyond? And in particular, Iran, where we've had some recent very interesting diplomatic developments in which you and George Shultz have written. Where do you see that going, and what are the kinds of warning signals you'd like to put up on the screen, if I could put it that way, that the administration and the Western, and indeed their Chinese and Russian partners as negotiators, need to keep in mind as they approach a broader and hopefully more comprehensive agreement?
Well, we live right now in a period, in a transitional period, because both China and the United States and these other countries are undergoing fundamental transformations. Our society, we are used to it, but we've changed our economy in the last year or so as a result of the energy discoveries. And also we've come to the point where we have been engaged in 4 wars that we entered with great unity and ended in terrible discord. So we can't continue to operate our foreign policy that way. So we are going through a transition period. The Chinese have just had the third plenum. I think this is a very important document. Of course, people say they can't carry all of this out simultaneously. Probably not, but if you put before the people a catalog of things that you want to accomplish, that puts down certain markers, and it affects every aspect of Chinese life. And I'm not sure that the Chinese know what they will find as they go down that road where they are talking about introducing a rule of law, and where they're talking about a level of anti-corruption that will affect millions of people, and when they're moving 400 million people from the countryside into the cities. So they're going through this transition. And it's important that as they go through this transition, we keep focused in the international field on the fundamental outcome and not get diverted by the irritations of the moment, like that aerial zone. I'm not arguing whether it should or shouldn't have been established, but it's not. There are 44 of these zones around the world. This one is in a particularly tense region, but all I'm saying is that now a comparable evolution is going on in India. And India will be maneuvering for its place. But we can't think of India as a design of American strategy. They'll take care of their own strategy, but we will be in the same world with them. Importantly and closely related, Japan for 50 years has been in an unhistoric position for Japan. It's been an economic superpower, but it's been traditionally a country very proud and insistent on its national tradition. And it is now going back to at least some, maybe much of it. So how that works out, these are things to keep in mind. Now, Iran, here is the fundamental long-term issue of Iran as I see it. For 15 years, American presidents have said that an Iranian nuclear military capability is unacceptable and that no option is off the table. On the other hand, American presidents have also said, and track 2 people like Tom have also said, there is no national conflict between Iran and the United States as long as Iran behaves like a national country and not as a revolutionary country in the region. So that's the issue now. Schultz and I wrote an article in which we say, we don't argue about the agreement. We said we are now, it can go one way or the other. It can either go to a period of increased tension, or it can go to a period in which the region moves towards progress and peace. So at the end of that process, there should not be a nuclear military capability, but there should be a very positive relationship between Iran and the United States. That is the challenge of the next year. And that's quite an assignment, because Iran has been an entity for thousands of years. They've dealt with a lot of foreigners, so they're not going to be outsmarted. So it's a question of, can we find that road? And I'd say the opportunity exists, but we have to know what we want to avoid and what we want to achieve. But Tom has made, on the track 2 basis, a huge contribution to where we are.
Well, thank you, Henry, but the really important issue is the one you just fastened on before that. Where can we go? What's the right road? Certainly we want to avoid a military nuclear potential on the part of Iran as much as we can. But we've now opened slightly a diplomatic process, and you've been master of doing that.
Well,
what's your advice to us about how to take that forward?
George and I wrote this article because we've been Secretary of State. We don't want to second guess a tactical negotiation. But we wanted to indicate a body of fact, perhaps, to which everybody could agree, and from which they could move forward. We say that there are 3 objectives for American policy now in the Middle East. We need to define, you cannot deprive Iran of any nuclear capability. So the question is to define a nuclear capability that is rationally related to civilian purposes, and to preclude that this is topic number 1. Topic number 2 is to think of assuming we can deal with number 1, but concurrently, what is the nature of a constructive relationship between Iran and the US? And third, how do you integrate all of this into the evolution? Now, we are not saying that we have an answer to all of these questions, but we think these are the markers that ought to be to guide our thinking and not get lost in a lot of technical detail.
Henry, question again from me, and then we'll go to the audience questions. And we are going to get to the audience questions, believe it or not. Iran takes me to Syria.
Oh my God.
I think we all feel that way about Syria. Is there a way forward with Syria? What is your advice as former secretary, former national security advisor, a part of the world in which we have a huge interest, not only in Israel, but in our Arab partners? The stability of the area is at risk. Jordan is certainly not in great shape, neither is Lebanon. Iraq is feeling the reverberations, and certainly our friends in Turkey are. There's a struggle going on to have a political conference. It doesn't look like there's a military solution in sight. There's no appetite on the part of the United States for jumping into yet a 5th conflict in the Middle East, either in Iran or in Syria. Where do we go?
Well, you know, as a general proposition, as a former Secretary of State, I have never volunteered advice to either the Secretary or the President.
That isn't the question I asked.
Let's say, no, that isn't. But I just want you to know that I'm not going around the world now about Syria. I actually have differed essentially with the analysis that has been made in our media and in much of our government on this. And in the following way. The prevalent analysis is that Assad is an evil man who is oppressing his people, and therefore Assad ought to go. And once he's removed, you can then get a united government of democratic people. And I don't agree with that analysis. I think Assad is certainly an unattractive figure, and he should certainly go as part of the process, but actually not at the beginning, because fundamentally this is a conflict between various religious sects in Syria. It is fundamentally a conflict between Shia and the Sunni, plus the many other minorities, Christians, Druzes, Kurds that live there. Therefore, in my analysis, any attempt to get a united government for all of Syria will lead to some form of oppression, because a united government will have to take care of all of these. So my view has been that the outcome in Syria should be based on some principles like Lebanon, that the various groups have a considerable autonomy and that there is some overall government. It is complicated in Syria because we are not only witnessing what I described, we are also witnessing the disintegration of the state system that was created in 1920 by the British and French as an extension of colonialism. So with really very artificial frontiers, so that the Syrian Sunnis reach into Iraq, and the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds affect Turkey, and but I would start with the principle that the objective is not to get a coalition government which everybody, the objective is to permit the various religious groups to coexist within defined limits, and to see whether we can define those limits. As a consequence of that, certainly Assad will not be there as a president at the end of that process. That's been my general idea.
In at the beginning, out at the end.
What do you mean?
Assad.
I think if the solution is properly designed, he will go he will become irrelevant.
Lots of autonomy somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do. But I think we have to
not talked about this.
No. I think we have to do this in some political forum. It isn't going to happen on its own. And Syrians aren't going to make it together.
I think we and the Russians have a parallel interest on this score, because both of us have an interest that the non-state groupings that exist there not become dominant. And the Russian interest is that they could easily spread into Russia.
Very much.
So on the issue of autonomy, I think Russia and we could cooperate, and of course Europe has a historic role. So I think some outside group has to be constituted that gets this process going.
An audience question. We've got a growing serious problem to the east of China with conflicting claims for territory. In one case with Japan and perhaps Korea, in other cases with Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, others. How do we deal with the bigger problem for the first time of having serious competing Chinese territorial complaints that after having settled with Russia and getting close to settling with India, we now have to see out there, and what's our role, if any, in trying to deal with that set of issues?
You know, I was National Security Advisor when that issue developed. And it developed in the following way. Japan had taken these islands from China in 1895 and administered them from Okinawa. Then in 1969, we, having occupied Okinawa as a result of the war, returned Okinawa to Japan. But then there was this uninhabited island lying out there, and both Chinese governments asked for it, but we had no relations with Beijing, and we didn't want to inflame the situation. So we came up with a formula. Alex Johnson came up. This was beyond my imagination. We came up with a formula that the island is under Japanese administrative control, but not under Japanese sovereignty. There was nothing to administer there because there were no people there. But 10 years later, Deng Xiaoping came to Japan and said, I don't know what that formula means, but why don't we just do what we're doing? And that went on for 30 years. Now, through a combination of events that will keep us here till dinner, the Japanese have acquired the island. So now it is a symbolic issue of the Chinese-Japanese confrontation. It goes beyond any conceivable merit of the island. What can we do? Well, it would be, we cannot have a war on that issue. Yep. And we should make that clear. And it shouldn't be solved by military means. And it cannot be beyond solution since there are no assets there that anybody must have. But how to get there, I'm sure that I'm counting on the Vice President having taken care of that problem.
He has 15 Foreign Service solutions in his pocket, I'm sure, Henry. Henry, let me go back to China. Xi Jinping looks more and more like a reformer, a perhaps more subtle kind of reformer than we've seen, but we'll wait and see. China is certainly both benefited and challenged by its own economy in terms of where it's going. Great confidence in Asia, and I think around the rest of the world, that China will, sooner than perhaps the specialists believe, be the #1 economy in the world. Where is Xi Jinping taking China as you see it? And what do we do when we're no longer the #1 economy in the world? That's, by the way, an audience question.
First of all, one shouldn't think of China as Xi taking China, because I think, in fact, as president, Xi has less power than the American president. He has considerable power, but he has the standing committee, which he cannot ignore,
In the military.
and he has the Politburo. So he has to try to form a consensus, but he's clearly the strongest individual, and he is the leader of China in that sense. Secondly, the interesting aspect of China, if one looks at it, every generation has represented some historical experience in China. And the revolution, then the reform of the revolution, then the integration of China into the rest of the world, then the technocratic side, and now we have the survivors of the Cultural Revolution. So these are people who have gone through great hardships and have survived. So there is a stronger assertiveness than their immediate predecessors. And they have this dilemma because they have talked about it. They have a pretty clear idea what they want to do in economic reform, but at least of the direction in which they want to go in economic reform. But they do not want to repeat the Gorbachev experience, where the process of reform then undermines the political cohesion. So Xi is trying to strengthen political control as a means of carrying out the economic reform. And one has to understand another thing. If you look at European history, when people moved from the countryside to the cities, you had then major political adjustments. Now you have 400 million people being moved into the cities. And so they cannot know exactly where this goes. And so they are trying to strengthen political control for the immediate future. If you read some of the objectives that they state in that third plenum, they will certainly, if they are reached, if the society becomes more constitutional and move from rules to law, that will change the political structure in some way. But where it will go, I don't think they are clear, except that Xi wants to remain in control of it. And that, to me, is very understandable.
A few wise thoughts on Pakistan?
There's always the last question that kills you.
No, it's the second to last question, Henry. I knew you scrupulously avoided it when I asked you before, so I thought I'd better come back.
No, Look, I know the problem that everybody does, but I don't pretend the solution. Historically, Pakistan has been created in opposition to India. It was the people who didn't want to live under Hindu
control.
rule. So therefore, when one says a degree of détente between India and Pakistan would be a precondition for a lot of things, that's the truth. But then you think of Kashmir, think of Afghanistan, and what happens to Pakistan if they lose this element. I have no wise thoughts on Pakistan.
My final question is on Russia, also an Asian power. Putin has been acting in what I think are best inconsistent and somewhat antagonistic ways, to put a kind of diplomatic low ball point on the difficulties. You know him, you've talked to him.
Yeah,
He plays the most serious role, I think, still in Russia as things are going ahead. That may or may not be diminishing, but he's around for a while. The one country in the world that has a kind of nuclear power that could wreak devastation on us and vice versa. We've been through all of that in the Cold War.
You know,
Where do we go with Russia? Where can that process end up? Is that a candidate for your view that we have to find some areas of common interest to move with?
well, first a general observation. When I was in Russia a few weeks ago, I asked a friend to get together for me some non-political Russians to see what they had to say. And one of them was a cardiologist who practices 80 miles from Moscow and who's written a diary of running a clinic. And it has nothing to do with politics. But when you read that, you see that running that country has its nightmarish aspects because of the morale of the people. I found it a really illuminating document, because it doesn't say anything about politics.
At all.
It just says this is what you need to do in this city to achieve a certain amount of health service. But let me get to the foreign policy side. Russia is a peculiar country, or it's a special country in the sense that its national pride has been generally focused on foreign activities and not on what it did internally. But now it is living in a world where its borders with China are a strategic nightmare. 30 million people on one side, billion plus on the other, and nobody wants to live in Siberia. No Russian wants to live in Siberia. The borders with the Muslim world are an ideological nightmare. And the borders with Europe are unhistorical in the Russian mind. So I believe, but this is a minority opinion, that Putin doesn't operate from a position of strength, but that he feels he has to show his people that Russia matters and that he can't hold anything together if he doesn't do that. Now, the area that worries me is the Ukrainian issue, because if Ukraine goes to Europe, we have one situation. If Ukraine goes back to Russia, then Russia is again at the borders of Poland, Romania, Hungary. And in that respect, on that front, what Putin wants is to restore as much of historical Russia as he can. And we in the West have to ask ourselves whether we got our priorities straight, whether we confused what we want to change in Ukraine with the direction of the Ukraine, and whether we wouldn't have been better off getting that issue settled first and then worry about when I said before that a number of countries have to define their orientation, I think this is especially true of Russia, because they are no longer the dominant country, and they know it. I think Putin, as a strategic thinker, is very serious. So, to the displeasure of many people, I've always argued we should deal with Russia on the basis of national interest and be sympathetic to reform in Russia, but not make that the goal of pressure. But there's no unanimous support for that position.
I understand that. I tend to go in your direction, having spent 3.5 years there, seeing what they are capable of doing, and seeing what misguided they can fall into huge traps. And it's not in our interest to have, in a sense, an unguided or misguided Russia circling around Asia or indeed Europe as the process goes ahead. Henry, we've been through an hour. It's been absolutely fascinating. What I said at the beginning was that I never attended a meeting with you where I didn't learn a great deal. Today is no exception. I hope the rest of you all agree, and I'd like to ask if you would to join me in a standing ovation for Dr. Henry Kissinger.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.